Good evening, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening to the release function of the ICDWA MEA publication, Indian Diplomacy and COVID Responses. I take this opportunity to welcome our distinguished guests. I also extend a warm welcome to the heads of foreign diplomatic missions in Delhi, representatives of the diplomatic corps, scholars and academics who have graciously accepted our invitation to join us. The program for the evening is as follows. We will begin with the screening of a short film on India's fight against COVID-19, the international dimension. Thereafter, Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, will give the welcome remarks. The book will be released by Dr. V.K. Paul, Member, Niti Aayog, Sri Rajesh Bhushan, Secretary, Health and Family Welfare, Government of India, Sri Harshvardhan Shringla, Foreign Secretary, Government of India, Sri Ravi, Secretary, Economic Relations, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, and Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs. This would be followed by remarks by our esteemed dignitaries. Thereafter, the vote of thanks will be proposed by Sri Shomen Bakchi, Deputy Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, followed by high tea. We begin this evening's program with the screening of the short film, India's Fight Against COVID-19, the International Dimension.
भारत ने 24 घंटे सतर्क रहते हुए, हर घटनाक्रम पर नजर रखते हुए सही समय पर सही फैसले लिए। भारत ने इस महामारी से जिस प्रकार से मुकाबला किया, उसका लोहा आज पूरी दुनिया मान रही है। कोरोना के विरुद्ध इस लड़ाई में हमने कदम कदम पर दुनिया के सामने उदाहरण प्रस्तुत किया है। ऐसे समय में जब कुछ देशों ने अपने नागरिकों को चीन में बढ़ते कोरोना के बीच छोड़ दिया था, तब भारत चीन में फंसे हर भारतीय को वापस लेकर आया। अब कोरोना के मरीजों के इलाज के लिए देश के हेल्थ इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर को और मजबूत बनाने के लिए केंद्र सरकार ने आज 15,000 करोड़ रुपए का प्रावधान किया है। अब कोरोना की वैक्सीन आ गई है, बहुत कम समय में आ गई है। अब से कुछ ही मिनट बाद भारत में दुनिया का सबसे बड़ा टीकाकरण अभियान शुरू होने जा रहा है। Indian civilization considers the whole world as one family. Our technology platform for COVID vaccination, the platform we call CoWIN, is being prepared to be made open source.
In planning and executing Vaccine Maitri, we are naturally guided by a determination to make a difference at a difficult moment for global society. Our reputation as the pharmacy of the world has been reinforced in that process. So indeed has the faith in Make in India.
When India grows, the world grows. When India reforms, the world transforms. मानवता के प्रति अपने दायित्व को समझते हुए भारत ने एक बार फिर दुनिया के जरूरतमंदों को वैक्सीन देनी शुरू कर दी है।
May I now invite our dignitaries, Dr. V.K. Paul, Member Niti Aayog, Shri Rajesh Bhushan, Secretary Health and Family Welfare Government of India, Shri Harshvardhan Shringla, Foreign Secretary Government of India, Shri Ravi, Secretary Economic Relations, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, and Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, to take their seats on the stage. Thank you. May I now request Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, to kindly make her welcome remarks.
Dr. V.K. Paul, Member, Niti Aayog, Shri Harshvardhan Shringla, Foreign Secretary, Shri Rajesh Bhushan, Secretary Health, Shri Ravi, Secretary Economic Relations, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the launch of the ICWA and MEA's joint publication, Indian Diplomacy and COVID Response. The COVID pandemic engulfed the world in 2000, impacting individuals, societies, and nations in a devastating manner and caused disruptions on an unprecedented scale. Lockdowns were imposed, masks became mandatory, lives and livelihoods were lost, travel and supply chains disrupted. Yet, in this period, we saw COVID warriors, whether it was healthcare workers, community workers, security forces, and others who worked tirelessly. Scientists and biologists raced against time to get out treatments and vaccines. In the midst of these extraordinary challenges and uncertainties, governments and leaders were called upon to manage the pandemic and its consequences. India faced the COVID challenges through a whole-of-government approach under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and each challenge was met resolutely. Dr. V.K. Paul, Member Niti Aayog, Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla, Secretary Health Rajesh Bhushan, Secretary Economic Relations Damu Ravi were involved in the management of many issues related to the pandemic, and we look forward to hearing their views. Today, India has successfully administered more than 1.87 billion vaccines. It has reopened its economy, educational institutions, and international flights, and is reconnecting to the world in person. However, government continues to constantly monitor the COVID situation. In the last 2 years, even as India was attending to its huge domestic requirements, it was mindful of the fact that the pandemic was a global crisis that required India to work with other countries and international organizations. Indian diplomacy adapted itself very quickly to meet the unprecedented situation and the challenging circumstances. As a country with a large diaspora, Indian nationals were assisted to return home from countries across the globe under the Vande Mataram mission, which included organizing various flights, setting up air bubble arrangements with other countries. In addition, Indian nationals were repatriated by land and by sea. At the same time, India worked with foreign missions for evacuation of their nationals from India. For all this, 24/7 MEA control rooms functioned. During the pandemic, India's image as the pharmacy of the world was cemented when essential medicines and medical equipments were dispatched in sizable quantities to more than 150 nations. Later, India, through its vaccine metri, provided vaccines to a large number of countries. And when India reached out to seek assistance during the pandemic, the response of the partner nations were forthcoming. The goodwill for India was evident. ICWA is therefore privileged to be associated with MEA on this project, which records India's response to the pandemic and the administrative and diplomatic work of the Ministry of External Affairs. I'm also happy to welcome amidst us heads of missions and members of the diplomatic corps with whom the ministry worked together and who helped us in the fight against the global pandemic. Finally, I take this opportunity to thank Foreign Secretary on behalf of ICWA for all the valuable support that he has given to this institution during his tenure. And we wish him the very best in the new phase, which begins at the end of this month. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now may I request the dignitaries on the stage to kindly release the book, Indian Diplomacy and COVID Response. Thank you. I now invite Shri Damu Ravi, Secretary Economic Relations, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, to make his remarks.
Good evening. Honorable Foreign Secretary, Madam Vijay Thakur Singh, Dr. Paul, Secretary Health, Rajesh Bhushan, friends, distinguished diplomats, colleagues. For me, it's really a rare honor. I consider this truly a rare honor to be here with you to say a few words on the practical experiences and how the Ministry of External Affairs and the whole of Government of India approach in tackling the crisis of this magnitude. You know, the virus has always felt, lived before us, had been before humanity, and will be there in the future. In the last 100 years, we have experienced, the world has experienced different kinds of viruses, beginning from Spanish flu, to HIV, to Ebola, to SARS, to MERS. But COVID is extraordinary in one sense, because it actually didn't spare anyone. They were all regional viruses, and countries were tackling their own crisis at that point of time. But in the case of COVID pandemic, it spared not even one island on the globe. That is the extraordinary crisis that humanity faced. How each country responded, tackled, is the most important part of it. And India's story is captured in the way it tackled, is captured in this book. And I would like to thank and express my sincere gratitude to the Foreign Secretary for being determined in bringing everything in this documentation. He didn't want it to just go away. He wanted government, the whole of government, to learn from the experiences and how India tackled it. Thank you very much, sir, for your guidance and direction and your determination. I also like to thank him for another reason. I was nobody when I was appointed as COVID coordinator. I came in from Department of Commerce on my deputation, and I had no clue on the day that I was designated as the COVID coordinator. And I thank for the confidence you had in me, sir, for reposing that confidence, both External Affairs Minister and Foreign Secretary, for giving me that job, which nobody knew how to deliver. But he gave me that confidence that, yes, we can all do it together. That came, from that day on, it was go. It was actually starting from the blocks. We're taking off. Not even a day we rested. It was a teamwork. There were day in and day out meetings. And the process of decision making is very interesting. And for me, also very truly revealing. Every department of the ministry had the inputs collated. By end of the day, we would all meet, the group of secretaries led by Cabinet Secretary. We would meet, and those decisions were taken to a group of ministers and then Prime Minister's guidance and direction. That's an extraordinary experience I personally felt. And then it was all of Government of India decision that was implemented. There are various facets to how India tackled the COVID pandemic. There is a learning, because no one knew what exactly the repercussions and implications, the consequences of it, but learning from each other. The COVID cell was created while everything else was shut in the government. The Ministry of External Affairs was shut, just like any other department, and the ministry was closed down. There were 100 people in the COVID cell working day in and day out. 24/7 operation it was. And we would work in the day and go back in the night and be connected with our missions abroad. And then get the inputs the next day and again discuss with Foreign Secretary what should we do then. The COVID cell was also analyzing the trends around the world, how each nation was tackling that crisis. Our missions were giving inputs. And then that information was so useful. Countries had quarantine regulations. Your testing, everything was so different from each experience. But then we had to learn from that experience, and we had to adapt to our own situations. Then came lockdown, nationwide lockdown, an extraordinary time. What happened in the times was we felt that human beings generally feel comfortable in their own environment, in the home environment. Either the expats living in India or the Indians abroad. That was the same sentiment. Now, how do you evacuate that many people safer to their home? This was an extraordinary dimension of the way we tackled the crisis. MEA's writ was accepted all over India. They trusted us. In a severe lockdown condition, we had to bring in foreigners resident in India all the way, remote corners to nearest airport. And the missions and the resident ambassadors had to be guided how to handle that crisis. And we were able to safely send our friends home to their homes. And then the VBM, the Vande Bharat mission. We had to bring in a large number of Indians, and that needed mapping. We had to find out who and where Indians were and what situation they were in. The students, elderly people, tourists, people who've lost their work because of COVID, pregnant women. Every kind of Indian who was outside wanting to come back, we had to map them. And that required a different skill. So we'd set a criteria. Everyone wanting to rush, but how do you bring those people who are actually in need of it? A criteria was set, again internally discussed. And we had to map out how do you send the flights to which destination. And then you take it to a destination and bring them back to their homes directly. That was a great experience. You needed planning, a detailed planning. You had to send flights to that country and to that hometown, not to international airport or Delhi or Mumbai that usually comes to our minds. This was, again, we had to do the planning. The MEA built a repat portal, which mapped all the NRIs, Indian residents outside India who wanted to come back. And by end of December of 2020, we had brought back everybody to their homes. And this didn't happen just because of COVID itself, but also everyone that was involved here, the officers here, and Foreign Secretary designated additional level officers, Joint Secretarial officers as state coordinators to take the charge, to guide the states in how they implement the quarantine regulations, the testing, and then safely take them to their homes. This was all done seamlessly. Then came a time when the nations generally tend to be conservative. They become nationalist in times of crisis. And this is normal for anybody. You have medicines. Would you like to share it with your friends? Or would you just keep it for yourself? It's for difficult times and difficult decisions. But as Prime Minister said in the screen, the whole world is one family. We had to live up to that sentiment and that objective that we lived all along. While administering medicines for our own people, we were also sharing with a large number of our friendly countries, countries that needed us. The pharmacy of the world had to be upheld, but there were also supply chain issues. You can be a pharmacy of the world, but unless you're able to ensure that the ingredients are elsewhere that are coming in are seamlessly moving into your country. That required a different kind of coordination and a different kind of challenge. Then came the vaccine Maitri. While you are vaccinating your own people in a crisis time, would you be able to share with your friends? That's another extraordinary gesture, which is all captured in the screen here. Then the second wave. The second wave again was a very, very unique experience where India was at the receiving end. And you had to tackle that enormous crisis and calamity on humanity. India needed cylinders, oxygen, medicines like remdesivir, tocilizumab, anything that mattered to save lives had to be coordinated. Doing all this also required the media management, educating public, informing public in the right sense of it. And in democracy, this is very normal. People will ask. Constituencies will ask. The members of parliament, they need to be briefed. The media need to be briefed. And many times you would have seen Dr. Paul and Health Secretary on the screen talking in PIB and regularly on a daily basis telling how India is tackling the crisis and assuaging fears and giving the right messages. I don't want to take much time. I can go on and on because this is a subject which is so dear to me. And at the end of the second wave, when I finally moved out of COVID, and then to my different responsibility, I was so happy that I professionally enriched and I contributed something to the whole exercise in tackling the unique experience of this COVID as a whole of Government of India approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. May I now invite Dr. V.K. Paul, Member Niti Aayog, to make his remarks.
Good evening. Foreign Secretary Shringla ji, Secretary Health Rajesh Bhushan ji, Ravi ji, Vijay Thakur Singh ma'am, Excellencies, dignitaries, friends. I'm truly privileged to be here at the launch of this wonderful book, Indian Diplomacy and COVID Response, in the presence of a galaxy of leadership in the space of diplomacy and with the leadership that executed many functions related to the COVID response. The underpinning of the government's response, the union government's response, and the philosophy which the Honorable Prime Minister gave us to follow is summarized by whole of government response, whole of societal response, whole of nation response. It was a mission that involved every citizen of India. Interface of the union government with state governments, Prime Minister reaching out directly to people, and structures within the government refashioning and juggling and then settling down into different groups. We call them empowered groups and more, was the way the government functioned at that time, as Ravi ji alluded to. I had the privilege to work with the Ministry of External Affairs, Shringla ji and his team, Ravi ji, Vikram Dorai Swami in particular, who was another key person, then Vinay Kumar ji, and now more recently Ramesh. These were the people who worked very closely with the rest of us on vaccination and on overall preparedness, where there was a very distinct role for the Ministry of External Affairs. This is a story that's captured in this book. The book is not fiction, above all. The book is not fiction. It is a true account and true compilation of facts, figures, actions, decisions, the processes that led to those decisions, and wonderful execution of those decisions. MEA rose to orchestrate in a different way, as Secretary Shringla writes in his introduction, that he had to refashion. We didn't know how to work. We churned. We settled down in working through a matrix. He uses the word matrix, he uses the word task forces. So this resilience on the part of MEA is very striking. And it was visible to all of us how major components of this response, such as Vande Bharat and others to which Ravi ji has already alluded, came through and was hugely successful. I enjoyed reading the book. I particularly enjoyed a wonderful chapter toward the end, which is working with the armed forces. And I was wondering now, what is this all about? It's a beautiful story of how the Indian Navy worked with MEA and, of course, other agencies to, in the first phase, mobilize citizens in nearby countries, 4,000 of them. That is the first phase, and then followed by the second phase, where it was mobilization for the liquid medical oxygen, the oxygen concentrators, and so on, and ventilators from various countries. That was Samudra Setu 2, and the first mobilization was Samudra Setu 1, or the original Samudra Setu. Very nice story as to how Navy rose to the occasion, something which I didn't optimally knew otherwise. This book, as I said, is not fiction, it's facts, but it also demonstrates how the ministry, under the leadership of the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary and the External Affairs Minister, really ensured that India's stature in the world community was heightened further. It was also a performance that ensured that our friendships across nations actually cemented and our partnerships grew. I think that is the final signature line that I see after knowing what was going on, but more importantly, after having read the entire body of work that went underneath. So you ensured as ministry that our friendships, and you can see the participation here, grew. They became stronger, more close, both mind, head and heart together. And we ensured that this nation's stature in the world community rose further. I was much more closely associated with the vaccine part of the efforts of the External Affairs Ministry. And I'm very happy to tell you that at every step, the team went well beyond the normal effort. You are aware of the Vaccine Maitri program. 7 crore doses were passed on to 95 countries. But that is just one part. The ministry ensured that the raw materials, story which you may have read in the report, in the newspapers, but behind that was a huge effort. Even for the mainstream vaccine, which eventually served the purpose of 80% of our vaccination program, needed certain critical ingredients. And at some point, because of a regulation, particular regulation in a particular country, there was a difficulty about ensuring adequate and spontaneous and continuing supply of those ingredients. It was background effort, huge effort, which was required to overcome that bottleneck at that point in time. You may not know that the BioE vaccine, the Corbevax, is a product, the starting product comes from Baylor, Texas Baylor School of Medicine. And it was diplomatic connect that ensured that the scientific and industrial interface was further facilitated. We also had significant difficulties about the raw materials, in particular an adjuvant for this particular vaccine, for which real huge effort was required, not only with the government of the US administration, but also with multilateral system called CEPI. This vaccine would not have been possible at all without the intervention, and a very strategic intervention on the part of the Ministry of External Affairs. Diplomatic efforts succeeded in having this wonderful vaccine. As you know, it's being used for children 12 to 14, but it's also going to be very soon an alternate for booster doses. It's the only protein subunit vaccine of the world at the moment and has a huge potential beyond the current situation as well. Success of our linkages through diplomatic channels with the US system, including academia. Our efforts through the Quad mechanisms to ensure vaccine availability was very important at a particular point in time when it came. Having to produce a foreign developed vaccine on Indian soil in a large facility of BioE in Hyderabad was a very bold decision at that particular time. Situation changed, but that stature that we gained offering the Indian soil for large-scale production, a vaccine which is developed elsewhere, and then to be supplied to multiple nations through 4 very important the partnership of 4 very important nations was another success, which I'm very, very proud of. Promoting CoWIN was very important. One of the stories that you might like to go through in the pages about how we negotiated with foreign companies for their vaccines, to get the vaccines into the country, the Pfizer, the famous Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson vaccines for scale up in the country. And you'll appreciate how Rajesh ji and myself and team from MEA, how we carried out very, I would say, in some sense, difficult negotiations with these companies, because they were asking for indemnity clauses, sovereign immunity waiver, and much more in some sense. And the vaccines were to come at a high price, except the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So it was a very tough phase because we needed those vaccines at that point in time. And we went through negotiations, and you have that story here, how this effort was made on behalf of the government of India, people of India. And then, of course, because certain things did not crack, and then the negotiations were stalled. In terms of vaccines, I think the story is still not ended. We are now making efforts through our missions to meet the demand of several countries to have vaccine and pharmaceutical production in their nations on their soil, or to make sure that they get vaccines for future eventuality by working together. That journey still continues. And in this regard, we see an opportunity for showcasing our health public goods to be made available to even a larger segment of the world's population. And here it's not only about these vaccines or only these pharmaceuticals. Our IT solutions, our approach toward TB elimination, our approach toward neonatal health care, for example, and our capabilities in ensuring the availability of affordable point-of-care diagnostics and so on are some of the public goods that need to be shared in the neighborhood and beyond. Another strength that has emerged, which has the potential to go far and wide, is the emergence of telemedicine and telehealth in our nation. In a way, we have come a very long way in our journey, and we have matured as a nation which uses telemedicine and teleconsultation as a way of life, more or less. And here, it offers us an opportunity to reach other countries for teleconsultation, telehealth, health promotion, and I think the possibilities are immense. We would like to see this chapter of working with other nations continuing into the next phase. But for the moment, a wonderful book, an account, a true account of the effort that has been made by our diplomatic corps, by the Ministry of External Affairs, and we are so grateful. We are so truly grateful to the world community and the nations for accepting India's roles, India's sincerities, and India's public goods that we were in a position to offer to the world. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. I now invite Sri Rajesh Bhushan, Secretary, Health and Family Welfare, Government of India, to make his remarks.
Dr. V.K. Paul, Member Niti Aayog, Shri Harshvardhan Shringla, Foreign Secretary, Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, Damu Ravi, Secretary, ER, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure to be part of this book launch on the crisis of the century, to use a cliched phrase. It not only represented, the COVID pandemic not only represents crisis of the century, but challenge of the century. What we fail to realize is that the national response to this pandemic also was on and is on an equally unprecedented scale. And it would not be wrong to call it response of the century. A national response where whole of the government, whole of the society worked together and effectively tackled the pandemic and addressed the challenges posed by the pandemic. They say that distance provides you with perspective. When one is living the pandemic, one is breathing the pandemic, one is unable to appreciate the magnitude of response that is mounted by multiple ministries spanning the federal government, the state governments, the community, various stakeholders. That is the context in which books and documentations like this become important. Because with the advantage of hindsight, with the advantage of distance, you can then appreciate that this is what we did. And as Sri Damu Ravi said, that when he transited from Ministry of Commerce to Ministry of External Affairs, as was given the charge of being the nodal officer for COVID management, he had absolutely no clue. Similarly, when in April 2020, I came from another ministry of the Union government to Ministry of Health, I also had no clue. But we must document these things because there are very critical questions. How did we manage to keep the per million cases within manageable limits? How did we manage to keep our COVID mortality per million within manageable limits? How did we scale up per million tests over a very short period of time? Who were the foot soldiers in our rural areas who went house to house and ensured that there was real-time surveillance, real-time monitoring, delivery of medicines at home? Even in quarantine and areas that were closed down, that quarantine was implemented with a human face. So these stories need to be documented, and that is where I would want to compliment both Ministry of External Affairs and Indian Council of World Affairs that they have come out with this book which very comprehensively documents this story. And this story, as Dr. Paul has pointed out, and so has Damu, that it is a multifaceted story, and each facet has very interesting dimensions. We started by evacuating Indian students who were stranded in China, particularly in Wuhan. And then it developed into the Vande Bharat mission, which had various phases, and eventually morphed into this air bubble agreement. To do this kind of a logistics exercise over an extended period of time has multiple challenges. It's a multi-stakeholder exercise. Although it was being led by Ministry of External Affairs, the Ministry of Civil Aviation played an important role, our missions abroad played an important role, the state governments in India played an important role because most of these airports were situated in different states. And there these people who were returning from multiple foreign countries had to be screened, and those logistics had to be managed. So it was not only stranded Indians who were focus of this, there were other people in different parts of India, various countries, various nationalities, who had to be sent back to their respective countries of origin. Not only air route, but land routes, sea routes, everything was used. So that itself, although there is only one chapter on this in this book, that itself warrants a full book. And then to talk of the pharmaceuticals and the vaccines. I remember it was May 2020 when very few countries in the world were talking of a vaccine for COVID. The Prime Minister convened a meeting where he said that we must have a task force which must encourage domestic promoters and domestic scientists to look into three aspects: drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines for COVID-19. As early as May 2020. It was in August 2020 that Dr. Paul and we were asked to head another body which popularly is called NEGVAC, which said that if and when vaccines become available, how would they be administered? So what this tells us is that being proactive helps, being multi-stakeholder helps, being a whole of government and whole of society approach helps. So these are things which need to be documented. One more snippet that I wanted to share with you, I think it is mentioned in passing in this book. Eventually, when vaccines manufactured in India, this is an important element, became available, the actual rollout started on 16th of January 2021. And on 20th of January 2021, within 4 days, the first consignment of Indian vaccines landed in Bhutan, one of our friends and neighboring countries. So that is the concept of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, or the entire world is a family, that we believe in. I cannot readily think of any other vaccine manufacturing country in the world during COVID times, which within 4 days of rolling out vaccination internally was delivering vaccines to other countries. So that is something that we need to strengthen going ahead, reinforce going ahead, because all the innovations that were triggered during COVID have long-term implications. There are a large number of vaccine preventable diseases where Indian vaccines can play a very critical role, and that is the area that we need to develop. So summing up, I would once again applaud the effort of Ministry of External Affairs in having documented all this, and I hope that there would be subsequent volumes of this book which would further refine and add to whatever has been documented. And I take this opportunity to convey my best to everyone who collaborated together and all those who were able to deliver the results on the ground. So thank you once again.
Thank you so much, sir. I now request Shri Harshvardhan Shringla, Foreign Secretary, Government of India, to make his remarks.
Dr. V.K. Paul, Shri Rajesh Bhushan ji, Shri Ravi, Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, ambassadors and representatives of the diplomatic corps who joined us today, my colleagues from the Ministry of External Affairs, all of our distinguished guests, invitees, ladies and gentlemen. It was actually in January 2020 that I returned back from a posting abroad to take up my current assignment. And no sooner than I had landed in Delhi, I realized that there was a phenomenon which is called COVID-19. Of course, none of us really knew what this is all about, but it seemed troubling, to say the very least. And as many of our colleagues have brought out before, this actually presented us with unprecedented situations. We had to really find our way in the dark. There were no precedents to guide us in our handling in our mitigation of this very, very troubling pandemic. But as we went along, of course, we found mechanisms that could deal with it. Rajesh Bhushan mentioned about NIGVAC. We had the committee of secretaries that met almost every day. We had the group of ministers to whom the committee of secretaries took their inputs and recommendations. And this went all the way up to the Prime Minister. And I'm very glad that some of our most important, the key partners and the players in the management of this crisis in India are here with us today in the form of Dr. V.K. Paul, Rajesh Bhushan ji, Shri Ravi, and of course many of us who are present here, and I'll come down to that. But this compendium that you have before you is really an attempt by the Ministry of External Affairs to record the diplomatic and administrative response of the ministry in dealing with the extreme challenges that the COVID-19 phenomenon posed. And today, as this pandemic seems to wane from its most, I would say, repressive form, its most virulent form, it may be useful for us to step back and try and see what this period was all about. And this monograph is really an attempt at doing just that. I have to thank Director General of ICWA, Master Vijay Thakur Singh, and our colleagues for really helping us put together this book and bring out this publication. It is correctly pointed out that this is work in progress. We continue to add to this. We continue to update it. We continue to also revise certain aspects of it. And we will come out with a publication shortly. I mean, a publication that we can disseminate. I'm told by my colleague Arindam Bakchi that an e-book is available. So that is something that possibly be sent out. But nonetheless, I think what is important is that we will try and bring it, streamline it to the extent that we can, add a few more details. And this story is not yet over. The story continues. We hope not for too long, though. In this entire process, I think what is important is that it was a whole of government approach, not just a whole of government approach, it involved a whole of society approach. That part has been brought out. Ministry of External Affairs was one component of this. We were a part of that effort, of the whole of government effort. And we were very proud to be a part of that effort. I think the success of that effort lay in our being able to work closely together, cooperate together, work not just with the concerned ministries and departments of the government of India, but also agencies, state governments, and a whole host of actors, and especially our colleagues in the diplomatic corps with whom we worked on several aspects of this exercise. Many of my colleagues who actually were part of that process are here. What I want to say is that, of course, Dammu led the entire thing because he was the head of our COVID cell. We could rely on him to work relentlessly, round the clock, to ensure that we delivered on the most important things. The pressures, the stress, I would say, was incredible. As the situation became more serious, more dramatic, the pressures on all of us increased. What I'm happy to say is that in retrospect, I think we were up to those pressures. Our colleagues really worked round the clock. If you talk about the fact that we did not miss office for a single day in the most severe of lockdowns, I think that itself says a lot, speaks volumes. My own office worked on every day. The only time that you were excused is when you contracted COVID yourself and were out of action. And it is true that many of our colleagues actually had severe cases of COVID, but they bounced back, came back with resilience, joined work, and went back into doing what they were doing. So it's quite incredible that people worked in a committed manner. You worked with a zeal that is rarely seen. One or two, of course, facts that I wanted to bring out in terms of some of the innovations that we used. One is that soon after this phenomenon began, and as the film that you saw showed us evacuations from Wuhan. It was very difficult because nobody could enter Wuhan, as we all know. Nobody knew how to liaise with the authorities. We had to send aircraft there. We had to send our embassy people there, who then had to stay there. They couldn't come out of the place. So they had to take the flight and come back and then be quarantined in India for about a month before you could get back to your station. But that was it. I mean, we went in, we got all our people out. But from that time, we set up what is called the COVID cell. The COVID cell, of course, was led by Damu, but we had at the base of it, we had a 24/7 operations room, which took calls, which had the latest information, which was on a virtual basis, collating info from Wuhan, from Iran, from Italy, from different parts of the world at that time from which we had to evacuate our citizens. And what is good about this is that this exercise involved everybody from the top, from our minister, external affairs minister, down to the junior most diplomat that we had in our ministry, which is essentially our officer trainees who were under training, were asked to go in and do this 24/7 shifts, which means that they did 8 hours at a time, but really worked themselves to the bone to make sure that we were delivering on what we had to do. In difficult times, difficult situations, you need extraordinary responses. And that is what we found in our colleagues in the ministry. We also, I think, in innovative terms, developed, made the best use of digital technologies. And this is the best manifestation of Digital India, that our colleagues brought out not one, but 2 different digital platforms. The first was when we started bringing our citizens back under what Damu described as Vande Bharat. We brought a record number of our citizens back, who were stranded all over the world after a 50-day lockdown in the month of May. I think the 7th of May, if I'm not mistaken. We were all part of that process and the number of meetings we had. But the fact is that we needed to record on a real-time basis who were the people coming back, what were their details, which flight were they coming back on, exactly what time was the flight reaching, which part of the country this was getting to. Every single detail of that individual is recorded in this digital platform that is created in the MEA, accessible by all in the system who are working on this. And what is quite unique was that this was actually a tool that was very, very functional. We set up, as Damu pointed out, that we had 1 additional secretary that looked after each state, and some of them are here with us today and worked very hard on that. So every state government, Karnataka, for example, had 1 officer, a single window on MEA with whom they could liaise. Now, if you were getting 5 flights into Karnataka, they had to just go into the portal and see which flights were there, which parts of the country they were coming from, what time they were coming, who were the sort of people coming in, and what their details were. And you prepared your quarantine, you prepared your responses accordingly. So you had some advance warning of 24 hours in which you got this detail and this data. The second utility of this data was that we were able to map out their skills. He's a welder, he's a carpenter. This man has a background in, he's a semi-skilled person. When later we worked with our Ministry of Skill Development, we worked with other concerned ministries, we used this data to help retrain, reskill these people who in many cases were retrenched from their work, had to come back to India, find them employment again in India or outside. And that was a great utility that was there. And that platform is still, that's a record which is available. We worked, of course, very closely with our friends in the diplomatic community in, as Damu mentioned, facilitating the return of your citizens back to your countries. That was a very important factor. But when the country was locked down so completely that you couldn't get out of your house, leave alone from one remote part of the country to the nearest airport, in Delhi or Bombay, I think that was quite a task. And we were really struggling to deal with things like getting groups of people who are stranded outside cities into the airport, make sure that they got their flights, got out. We worked closely with many of you. And we managed to get record numbers of people out, back to their countries, back to their homes, as we brought back our own citizens into our own country. The second digital platform was set up during the second wave. At the second wave, many of our friends in the diplomatic community, friends abroad, came together to help under difficult times. I think Rajesh also mentioned that in the second wave, we had over 400,000 cases a day. as compared to the first wave where the maximum was about a lakh of people, 100,000 people. Now, no hospital infrastructure can take, 4 times, 5 times, 10 times the numbers that you're normally used to at a single go. Obviously, our systems came under severe strain, and what was really needed was liquid medical oxygen, oxygen generating capacity. You needed medicines, as Damo mentioned, such as amphotericin B, all sorts of medicines which remdesivir, which we didn't hear of until we made desperate efforts to procure them from all over the world. Raw materials, the actual finished product, anything which was possible. And in that effort, what we did was we created this digital platform. By we, I mean the ministry. And this platform actually recorded each and every item that came, which flight it came in, which of the items, where they had come from, where were they intended. That was most important. The Ministry of Health did a phenomenal job in making sure that this platform, we knew beforehand that this consignment, bringing, say, 200 concentrators would go to this hospital in Noida. Or this aircraft bringing in 2 oxygen generating plants would go to hospitals in Jaisalmer in Rajasthan. And that information was made available to the donors, to those who were involved in this exercise, and people could go and verify for themselves the equipment, how it was working, how well it was received, what impact it was having. So it was a measure of transparency that was provided, more important on a real-time basis, so it was all there for us to see. We were also happy that all of our joint secretaries, head of territorial divisions themselves got involved in this exercise, went to the airport themselves to receive consignments with ambassadors, and were able to actually instill or boost confidence in our public at a difficult time, that we were not alone, that our efforts at Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam was also reciprocated by some 50 odd countries across the world who came to us in our time of need. So I think this is an important fact also that was recorded, and it's an interesting aspect of this. One aspect, of course, is that COVID was a major preoccupation. We dealt with it in a way that immersed us, but we also had to deal with our normal diplomatic activities, crisis on our borders in different parts of our region and the world. We are all aware of the many factors that came up in 2020, 2021, even while we were dealing with COVID. But the fact is that we had to make sure that we had the wherewithal to do both. Now, in terms of outreach, sheer outreach, in terms of, let's say, making sure that we worked on a global scale internationally with countries across the world, we undertook several initiatives. I'll just mention a couple of them. The first was the initiative that our Prime Minister took around March, it must have been around March 20th, to convene the leaders of the SAARC group. All of the leaders came together and exchanged notes on how we were dealing with COVID-19. So it's a regional consultations. And more importantly, created the SAARC COVID Response Fund, which generated funds that enabled us to send equipment and medicines to each other. And that was important. Our health ministry organized training of health professionals, health workers in our region as a follow-up to that particular summit. The Prime Minister then suggested to the G20 that we convene an extraordinary meeting to consider the COVID-19 crisis. If you look at the fact that G20 had never convened outside of economic or financial issues, this is quite unprecedented. And Saudi Arabia, which was the president at that time, responded. We had this virtual meeting. And our Prime Minister at that time said in a statement, he said, this is the first time that the G20 has met on a humanitarian issue. I mean, it's, again, very, very unique. And I think we haven't looked back. The G20 in the Rome presidency considered health as one of the main issues that took up the COVID-19 situation. There was a special summit of that issue. And I think this has become an issue that is to stay. Health diplomacy is something that is very, very critical to us. And I think Dr. Paul, Rajesh, Damu all spoke about what we're doing in terms of working with other nations in our quest to ensure that we share, but we also receive and pool our resources together. We were very fortunate that in July, many of you responded and we were able to have this meeting with the diplomatic community. I think it was the 20th of July, 2020 in Vigyan Bhavan, where a lot of our diplomatic colleagues were briefed in detail what we were doing to deal with the COVID crisis. And of course, when the vaccines were out, or well before the vaccines were out, we took the diplomatic community on a visit to Hyderabad, where you visited Biological E, you visited Bharat Biotech, many of our indigenous manufacturers of vaccine. You got a sense of what we are doing in cutting-edge research, genomics research. There's a huge amount of work that has gone into that, pioneering work. And this is again something that we are quite happy to take forward in sharing with our neighboring countries, with Africa, with our partners across the world. So there's a fair amount that has happened in much of what we have recorded in this monograph. I think talking about some of the detail has already been addressed in many senses. And I just want to bring out a few factors very quickly that the publication might highlight. One is that the ministry managed whatever we did, the work that we did, not only within the ministry, but with our missions and posts all over the world. We used to convene virtual conferences with our heads of missions. The Prime Minister was the first to do it, of course, but MEA convened regular meetings at the level of our minister, at my level, at the level of the secretaries. Secretary Ravi himself conducted many meetings. So we were regularly in touch with our missions and posts. We were one team that worked on this aspect together. And this factor has been brought out, but what also is important is that we didn't expend more resources than we were allocated. We did it within budget. We also took the help of many of our community associations to help those of our compatriots who were stranded all over the world. And I think a generous use of the Indian Community Welfare Fund also helped us tide through a very difficult time. The second, of course, is that we adopted a matrix structure like that of startups or big tech companies. Existing chains of commands were re-engineered, assigned specific pandemic-related roles. I've gone through some of them. Task forces were created to deal with specific issues. And essentially, the ministry dealt with it in a very innovative manner to deal with unexpected challenges that often came up almost overnight. Existing coordination mechanisms that integrated and mobilized the ministry's global networks of missions and posts were repurposed, plugged into national networks dealing with domestic problems. So this facilitated a non-siloed approach when mounting joint operations. Our ministry and our embassies were able to work harmoniously, efficiently, and effectively, as Dr. Paul mentioned, with all of our colleagues, the armed forces, for instance, under severe constraints of time, operating freedom due to restrictions and lockdowns. We organized missions to different parts of our neighborhood to assist in dealing with, in many senses, a crisis that they had no, I would say, capacity and little capacity to handle. And at their request, we mobilized many rapid response teams. We mobilized medicines. We mobilized food assistance where needed in many cases. So we worked with our colleagues in the Navy and other agencies. We mentioned the COVID cell, control room structure, how to deal with it, reliance on technology, I mentioned that, and essentially all this was done on the hoof, on the move, I would say, and a lot of innovation, a lot of quick, I would say, responses were required, which were needed to deal with unusual and unprecedented circumstances. And of course, what is important also is to be able to get our information out, get the right facts and figures out, get the details out that we did very promptly, as effectively as possible, both out of Delhi as well as through our missions and posts. We got real-time information from our colleagues in the Ministry of Health and Niti Aayog. We use that in a very, very I would say, expeditious way. Two of our colleagues who were, I think, a vital part of that effort, who couldn't be here today. One is Ms. Aparna S., who was Secretary of our Pharmaceuticals Department, who was part of our empowered groups on vaccines, and Bharatlalji, who also was there in the empowered group that dealt with sourcing of products in the first wave, and later, of course, in our vaccine empowered group. And I want to thank them as well for the help that they have given us in dealing with this issue. Information, misinformation, these are important. These are factors that did preoccupy us during the pandemic because everybody was under lockdown. It was important that you got the right information across. You didn't want to create panic. You wanted to ensure that people retain their confidence. At the same time, no wrong information went out, which would have unnecessarily created some levels of concern. So outreach based on facts and figures was important, and the ministry worked with all others, including our Press and Information Bureau, to make sure that we were getting the right message across to all concerned. And of course, the ministry had to keep its systems running over a massive geographical area. In other words, we had a global outreach and we worked in that regard. And many of our missions and posts really, worked very innovatively, found solutions for very difficult problems. So let me try and bring to a close a fairly reasonably long diatribe that I've indulged in by thanking all those who are here. I think all of you who are here for your interest, all of our colleagues and friends who worked with us so cooperatively, so diligently. Difficult to name all of them, but many of them are here, happy to see them. I'm also happy to see many of our distinguished senior colleagues who are here. Thank you for joining us. And we do hope that this exercise will provide some sense of what the ministry has done. As I said, it's not a complete work, but we hope that as we go along, we will keep adding to this. Let's just say that it was a privilege to work with the team that is here. The leadership was provided, of course, with the Honorable Prime Minister himself. The External Affairs Minister was certainly at the forefront of showing us, giving us the guidance that was important and in difficult times, inspirational. They have led from the front, and we have emulated this to try and do that ourselves in our own ways. So thank you so very much, and namaskar. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I now request Sri Shomen Bagchi, Deputy Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, to propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening. Member Niti Aayog, Dr. V.K. Paul, Foreign Secretary Ambassador Harshvardhan Shringla, Home Secretary Mr. Rajesh Bhushan, Secretary Economic Relations Ambassador Damu Ravi, ambassadors and members of the Diplomatic Corps, former Indian ambassadors, senior academicians, my colleagues from MEA, IFS probationers, and students from Delhi University, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, on behalf of Director General ICWA, I thank the 4 dignitaries on stage, our 4 guest speakers, for taking time out of their very packed schedules to come and share their thoughts with us. They have been, as you're all aware, some of the key principal actors in this entire effort, and we got the opportunity to hear it all firsthand from them today. And I think their remarks leave us in no doubt, I'm sure most, if not all of you would agree, that Indian diplomacy's performance in countering this extraordinary, unprecedented challenge has been nothing short of outstanding. The virus is not yet fully behind us, though its most virulent form might be. But to any observer watching the action from the periphery, and I'm one such, Indian diplomacy has emerged with flying colors. And when I say Indian diplomacy here, I mean the entire diplomatic and related efforts, whether administrative, logistical, whatever, led by the Honorable Prime Minister, involving several ministries and agencies of government and India's missions and posts abroad. Secondly, I'm glad to see the turnout of the local diplomatic corps, perhaps another reflection of the close cooperation on this subject that has been happening over the past 2 years. Given the global nature of this crisis and the need for joint action, it left virtually nobody unaffected. And the virus doesn't know any political borders. And ideally speaking, our response to countering it should also not know any. And happily, over the past 2 years, and some of them have been mentioned here, there are numerous glorious examples of collaborative and coordinated actions and efforts by members of the international community at all levels. And whether in research, in medical assistance, in pharmaceutical supply, in vaccine supply, in supply of other essential items and equipment, in evacuation. And timely action and cooperation made all the difference. It was literally, and it is literally a matter of life and death. And this cooperation that took place, this collaborative work, I'm sure you'll agree, saved hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of lives. So I'm thankful to the ambassadors and other diplomats for being present on this occasion. Today's program is also perhaps a record of sorts in ICWA for the number of MEA officers that are attending, because I've been here for a while and I've never seen so many of you at any event in ICWA. Thank you for being here. My distinguished colleagues who have come here, of course, have been the backbone of this entire effort, of the entire diplomatic effort, and a large share of the credit for its success must go to them, to the ones who are here, to the ones back in the ministry and in other ministries and agencies of government, and those in the Indian missions and posts abroad. Working behind the scenes, tirelessly till the mission is accomplished, even if it looks like it's mission impossible, which I'm sure on many occasions it must have looked like. Now, coming to the book itself, the authors of this volume are all senior MEA officers, some of whom are present here. And among its editors are 2 research fellows of ICWA, and they deserve our special praise and appreciation for making this publication possible, and thereby bringing out in the public domain these facts, these challenges, the achievements, and all the other information. This is a document for posterity. And while thanking all the others who have joined us here this afternoon, I want to specially mention our young friends from Delhi University. I believe there are about 50 of you who are here for coming and joining us. And I'm sure what you have heard and seen will encourage you to believe, if not convince you, that the Indian government has both the will and the capability to measure up to and to counter any challenge that confronts the country and its citizens, undaunted and undeterred by its enormity and its complexities, and will pursue its resolution relentlessly till the mission is accomplished. Finally, I'd like to thank my Director General, Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, for her leadership, for her guidance, my colleagues Nutan Mahavar, Vaibhav Tandle and Sagar Mehta, and many others in the ICWA staff who have worked to put this event together. As I said, the virus is not behind us. Its most virulent form may be, but today still is a day of celebration. It's a happy occasion. And there are many in this room who have every reason to feel proud of what they have done and that they have achieved over the last 2 years. And on that note, I invite you to refreshments which have been served in 2 places, one just outside the auditorium in the foyer, and the second in a hall which is to the right after you exit the foyer. Once again, thank you very much.